The sound of her sobbing carried across the cemetery in the moonlight, each broken cry slicing through the October night like a blade through tender flesh. Samuel Barrett had been tracking an elk for 3 days through the Ozark Mountains when he stumbled upon the small graveyard on the outskirts of Bentonville, Arkansas. And there she was, collapsed over a fresh mound of earth, her body shaking with grief so profound it made his chest tighten with an unfamiliar ache. The year was 1876, and Samuel had spent the better part of his 32 years avoiding civilization, preferring the company of pine trees and mountain streams to the complicated entanglements of people. But something about the raw desperation in her weeping stopped him cold in his tracks. He should have kept walking. A man like him, broad-shouldered and weathered from years in the wilderness, with hair that touched his collar and a beard that needed trimming, had no business intruding on a stranger's private mourning. But his boots carried him forward anyway, moving through the tall grass until he stood at the edge of the cemetery, watching her shoulders heave with each sob. She wore a simple black dress, and her blonde hair had come loose from its pins, spilling across her back in tangled waves. The moonlight painted everything silver and blue, making the scene feel dreamlike and somehow sacred. Samuel cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle her. She jerked her head up, eyes wide and red-rimmed, her face streaked with tears that glistened in the pale light. She looked young, maybe 24 or 25, with delicate features that were currently twisted in anguish. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, two strangers connected by nothing but this strange midnight encounter. "I did not mean to intrude," Samuel said, his voice rough from days of silence. "I heard you from the woods." She wiped at her face with trembling hands, trying to compose herself but failing. "You should go," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "This is not your concern." Instead of leaving, Samuel moved closer, his long strides eating up the distance between them. He settled himself on the ground beside the grave, his muscular frame folding down with surprising grace for a man of his size. The action was simple but deliberate, a wordless statement that he was not going anywhere. She stared at him in confusion, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Sitting," Samuel replied. "You should not be alone out here in the dark, not safe." "I do not care about safe," she said, her voice breaking. "I do not care about anything anymore." Samuel did not respond to that. He just sat there, his presence solid and steady beside her grief. After a moment, she turned back to the grave, her fingers digging into the freshly turned earth as another wave of sobs overtook her. He watched the stars wheel slowly overhead, listened to the crickets singing in the grass, and waited. Time stretched and contracted in strange ways. Minutes felt like hours, and hours passed like minutes. The moon traced its arc across the sky, and still Samuel sat there, a silent sentinel keeping watch over her pain. Eventually, her sobs quieted to hiccups, and then to shaky breaths. She remained draped over the grave, but some of the desperate intensity had leaked out of her. Samuel pulled a canteen from his belt and held it out to her. She looked at it for a long moment before accepting it with trembling hands. The water was cold and clean, drawn from a mountain spring that morning, and she drank deeply. "Thank you," she whispered, handing it back. "Who was he?" Samuel asked gently, her face crumpled again, fresh tears tracking through the dirt on her cheeks. "My brother Thomas. He was only 17. She pressed her palm flat against the wooden marker at the head of the grave. "Fever took him 4 days ago. I have been coming here every night since we buried him. I cannot sleep. I cannot eat. I just keep thinking he is going to come home, and then I remember he never will." Samuel felt something crack open inside his chest. He knew about loss, about the particular agony of watching someone you love slip away. "I am sorry," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "Everyone keeps telling me it will get easier," she continued, her voice hollow. "That time heals all wounds. But how? How can time fix this? He was supposed to have a whole life ahead of him. He wanted to be a lawyer, did you know that? He was so smart, always reading, always asking questions. And now he is just gone, and the world keeps turning like it does not even matter that someone so wonderful is no longer in it." "It matters," Samuel said firmly. "He mattered. Your grief proves that." She turned to look at him fully for the first time, really seeing him. The mountain man with his weathered face and steady gray eyes, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of mountains. "Why are you here?" she asked. "Why did you stay?" Samuel considered the question. "Because no one should have to carry pain like this alone," he said finally. "And because I know what it is like to lose someone." She searched his face, finding truth there. "Who did you lose?" "My sister. 10 years ago now. She was 18, about to get married. Influenza swept through our settlement, took half the town with it. I was off in the mountains, trapping. By the time I got back, she had been in the ground for 3 weeks. He paused, the memory still sharp after all these years. "I sold everything after that, left civilization behind. Figured if I stayed in the wilderness, I could not lose anyone else." "Did it work?" she asked softly. "No," Samuel admitted. "You cannot outrun grief. It follows you everywhere like a shadow, but you can learn to carry it. And having someone beside you makes the burden lighter." The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, the deep black fading to indigo and then to pale lavender. Dawn was coming, bringing with it the promise of a new day whether they wanted it or not. The woman looked exhausted, her face pale and drawn, dark circles heavy under her eyes. But something had shifted in her expression, some small easing of the desperate anguish that had consumed her when Samuel first arrived. "I should go," she said reluctantly. "My aunt will be worried. I am staying with her in town." "Where are your parents?" Samuel asked. "Dead." "Cholera, 6 years back. Thomas and I only had each other after that." Her voice caught. "And now I only have myself." Samuel stood, extending his hand to help her up. She hesitated before placing her small hand in his much larger one. He pulled her to her feet easily, his strength evident in the effortless motion. She swayed slightly, unsteady from hours of kneeling on the cold ground, and he steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "What is your name?" he asked. Katherine Walsh." She looked up at him, having to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "And you are Samuel Barrett. Folks call me Sam when they call me anything at all." A ghost of a smile flickered across her face, there and gone in an instant. "Thank you, Samuel Barrett, for sitting with me. For not leaving me alone." "Will you be back tonight?" he asked. She nodded. "I cannot seem to stay away. I know it is just earth and wood and his body, that Thomas is not really there anymore, but I cannot leave him alone in the dark." "Then I will be here too," Samuel said. Katherine blinked in surprise. "You do not have to do that. I am sure you have more important things to do than babysit a grieving stranger." "Nothing more important than this," Samuel said, and he meant it. Something had shifted in him during those long hours sitting beside her in the dark. Some part of him that had been frozen for 10 years was beginning to thaw, and it was both terrifying and strangely wonderful. Katherine studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I will see you tonight then." She walked away through the cemetery, moving carefully between the headstones as the sun broke over the horizon, painting the world in shades of gold and amber. Samuel watched her go, then turned his attention to the grave she had been weeping over. Thomas Walsh, the marker read. Born 1859, died October 1876. Beloved brother. The wood was fresh and raw, the letters carved with care but unpracticed hands. Samuel reached out and touched the marker, a silent promise forming in his heart. He spent the day in the woods surrounding Bentonville, checking his traps and hunting for game. The elk he had been tracking was long gone, but he managed to bring down a decent-sized buck. He dressed it in the forest, taking the choice cuts and leaving the rest for the scavengers. His hands worked with practiced efficiency, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the night's events over and over. Catherine's face haunted him, the raw grief in her eyes, the way her voice had broken when she spoke about her brother. By the time he made his way back to town, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant streaks of orange and purple. Bentonville was a modest settlement, grown up around a central square with a general store, a church, a saloon, and a scattering of homes and businesses. Samuel avoided the main streets, skirting around the edges until he reached the cemetery. True to her word, Katherine was already there, kneeling beside her brother's grave with her head bowed. This time, Samuel did not hesitate. He walked straight to the grave and settled himself beside her, just as he had the night before. She looked up at him, and this time there was something almost like gratitude in her expression along with the grief. "You came," she said softly. "I said I would." They sat in silence as darkness fell around them. Catherine's tears came slower tonight, less violently, but no less painful to witness. Samuel found himself wanting to do something, anything, to ease her suffering, but he knew from his own experience that grief had to run its course. All he could offer was his presence, and so that was what he gave. "Tell me about him," Samuel said after a while. "Tell me about Thomas." Katherine drew in a shaky breath. He was stubborn, impossibly stubborn. Once he set his mind to something, there was no talking him out of it. When he was 12, he decided he wanted to read every book in the church library. It took him 2 years, but he did it. She smiled through her tears. "He used to drive our Aunt Martha mad, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked and why people did the things they did. That is why he wanted to study law. He said the world was not fair, and he wanted to help make it more just." "He sounds like he was a fine young man," Samuel said. "He was. He was so good, Samuel, the kind of good that makes you want to be better yourself." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And now all that potential, all that goodness is just gone, wasted." "Not wasted," Samuel countered gently. "He changed you, changed the people around him. That does not disappear just because he is gone. The mark he left on the world remains." Katherine turned to look at him, something shifting in her expression. "You have a kind heart for a man who lives alone in the wilderness." "Maybe that is why I live alone in the wilderness," Samuel said with a slight quirk of his lips. "Easier than letting people see it." They talked through the night, their conversation wandering from topic to topic. Katherine told him about growing up in St. Louis, about moving to Arkansas after her parents died, about the struggles of starting over in a new place. Samuel shared stories of his life in the mountains, of tracking animals through the snow, of nights spent under stars so thick they looked like spilled sugar, of the peculiar peace that came from being truly alone in the wilderness. As dawn approached, Catherine's exhaustion was evident in every line of her body. But there was something different about her tonight, some small spark of life returning to her eyes. Samuel walked her back to the edge of town, keeping a respectful distance but making sure she made it safely. He watched her slip into a neat white house with blue shutters, then made his way back to his camp in the woods. The pattern continued. Every evening, Samuel would arrive at the cemetery to find Katherine already there, and they would sit together beside Thomas's grave until sunrise. Slowly, gradually, Katherine began to heal. The desperate, consuming grief began to transform into something she could carry, and Samuel was there for every step of that transformation. On the 5th night, She brought a blanket and insisted they sit on it rather than directly on the cold ground. On the 7th night, she smiled at something he said, a real smile that reached her eyes. On the 10th night, she fell asleep with her head resting against his shoulder, and Samuel sat perfectly still for 3 hours, afraid to move and wake her, marveling at the trust she had placed in him. It was on the 14th night that something shifted between them. The air had turned colder, winter beginning to assert itself, and Katherine arrived at the cemetery wrapped in a thick shawl. Samuel had started a small fire in a sheltered spot near the grave, gathering stones to contain it properly. When Katherine saw it, she stopped short, her eyes filling with tears. "You made a fire," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thought you might be cold," Samuel replied, suddenly uncertain. "I can put it out if you do not want it." "No." She moved closer, settling beside the fire and extending her hands toward the warmth. "It is perfect, thank you." They sat together, the firelight dancing across their faces, and for the first time since Samuel had met her, Katherine initiated the conversation. "What are you going to do when winter really sets in?" she asked. "Will you stay in these mountains?" Samuel considered. "Usually I head further south this time of year, or hole up in a cabin I have in the high country. But I am thinking I might stay around Bentonville for a while." "Why?" Katherine asked, though her eyes suggested she already knew the answer. "Because I am not ready to leave yet," Samuel said honestly. "Because I want to make sure you are all right." Katherine was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I am going to be all right," she said finally. "I am not healed, not even close, but I am going to survive this. And it is because of you, Samuel. You gave me something to hold on to when I had nothing left. You showed me that I do not have to carry this pain alone." "You did the same for me," Samuel said quietly. "I have been alone for so long, I forgot what it was like to care about someone. To have someone care about me. These past 2 weeks, sitting here with you, I have felt more alive than I have in 10 years. Katherine turned to look at him, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. "What are we doing, Samuel? What is this?" "I do not know," he admitted. "But I know I do not want it to end." She reached out and took his hand, her small fingers lacing through his calloused ones. "Neither do I." They sat like that for hours, hands clasped, watching the fire burn down to embers as the sky began to lighten. When Katherine finally stood to leave, Samuel stood with her. But this time, instead of watching her walk away, he walked beside her all the way to her aunt's house. At the door, she turned to face him. "Will I see you tonight?" she asked. "Every night," Samuel promised. "For as long as you need me." "And what if I need you for a very long time?" Samuel reached up and gently tucked a strand of blonde hair behind her ear, his rough fingers surprisingly gentle against her skin. "Then I will be there for a very long time." Katherine rose up on her toes and pressed a soft kiss to his bearded cheek. "Good night, Samuel." "Good night, Katherine." As he walked back to his camp, Samuel felt something unfurling in his chest, something bright and warm and terrifying. He was falling in love with Katherine Walsh, with her strength and her vulnerability, with the way she faced her grief head-on instead of running from it. And the thought of eventually leaving, of returning to his solitary life in the mountains, felt like contemplating cutting off his own arm. The next night, Katherine met him at the cemetery with a basket. "I brought food," she announced. "Real food, not just hardtack and jerky. My aunt insisted. She wanted to thank the man who has been keeping me company." "She knows about me?" Samuel asked, surprised. "Of course." "She is not blind, Samuel. She has noticed that I come back every morning looking a little less broken than the night before. She wanted to know what had changed, so I told her about you." Katherine set the basket down and began unpacking it. "She would like to meet you properly. Wants to invite you to Sunday dinner." Samuel felt a flutter of something like panic. "I am not good with people, Catherine. I have been living rough for too long. I do not know how to sit at a proper table and make polite conversation." "You have been sitting with me every night for 2 weeks, and our conversations have been anything but difficult," Catherine pointed out. "Besides, Aunt Martha is not looking for polite. She is looking for genuine. And you, Samuel Barrett, are the most genuine person I have ever met." Over the meal of fried chicken, biscuits, and apple pie, Catherine told Samuel more about her aunt. Martha Walsh was her father's sister, a widow who had never had children of her own. She had taken Catherine and Thomas in after their parents died, giving them a home and a chance to start over. She ran a boarding house in Bentonville, catering to travelers and merchants passing through on their way to Fort Smith or Springfield. "She is going to try to mother you," Catherine warned with a smile. "Fair warning, she cannot help herself." "I have not been mothered in a very long time," Samuel said. "Might be nice." As the night wore on, they found themselves talking less about Thomas and more about other things. Catherine asked Samuel about his life, about what had drawn him to the mountains in the first place. He told her about growing up in a small farming community in Missouri, about learning to hunt and trap from his father, about the restlessness that had always lived in his bones, pushing him to wander. "After my sister died, I used that as an excuse to do what I had always wanted to do anyway," he admitted. "Leave everything behind and disappear into the wilderness. It was easier than facing my grief, easier than watching my parents mourn, easier than building a life in a place that reminded me of what I had lost." "And now," Catherine asked softly, "now I am starting to think that maybe the easiest path is not always the right one," Samuel said. "Maybe some things are worth the difficulty, worth the risk of pain." Catherine's hand found his in the darkness. "I am terrified," she whispered, "of what I am feeling, of how much I have come to depend on you in such a short time. What if you leave? What if I lose you too?" Samuel brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I cannot promise that nothing will ever happen to me," he said honestly. "Life is unpredictable and death comes for us all eventually, but I can promise that I am not going anywhere by choice. Not anymore. Not when I have finally found something worth staying for." Tears streaked down Catherine's face, but they were different from the tears she had shed over her brother's grave. These were tears of relief, of hope, of a heart beginning to open again after being shattered. Samuel pulled her close, wrapping his strong arms around her, and she buried her face against his broad chest. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other as the stars wheeled overhead. Sunday came, and Samuel found himself standing on the porch of Martha Walsh's boarding house, wearing the cleanest clothes he owned and feeling absurdly nervous. He had faced down grizzly bears with more composure than he felt facing the prospect of Sunday dinner. But when Catherine opened the door, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure at seeing him, all his nervousness melted away. Martha Walsh turned out to be a plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and capable hands. She took one look at Samuel and immediately began fussing over him, insisting he looked too thin, that he needed a proper meal and maybe several more after that. The dinner was excellent, the conversation flowed easily, and by the time Samuel left that evening, he had been invited back for the following Sunday and every Sunday after that. The nights at the cemetery continued, but they took on a different quality now. The grief was still there, would always be there in some form, but it was no longer the only thing between them. Romance began to bloom in that unlikely place, growing slowly but steadily like flowers pushing up through snow. Samuel would bring Catherine little gifts from the forest. Interesting stones, feathers from rare birds, wildflowers that somehow still bloomed despite the approaching winter. Katherine would bring books from her aunt's collection and read aloud to him by firelight, everything from poetry to adventure stories to philosophical treatises. One particularly cold night in early November, nearly a month after they first met, Samuel brought a pile of furs and built a proper shelter near the grave. "I am not letting you freeze out here," he said when Katherine protested that he was going to too much trouble. "And before you argue, know that I am more stubborn than you are." Katherine laughed, the sound bright and unexpected. "I doubt that very much." "Only one way to find out," Samuel said with a grin. Wrapped in furs and warmed by the fire, they talked about the future for the first time. Katherine admitted that she had been thinking about what came next, about what she wanted to do with her life now that she was alone. She had some money from her parents' estate, enough to live on for a few years if she was careful, but she wanted to do something meaningful with her life. "Thomas wanted to make the world more just," she said. "I want to honor that. Maybe I could teach, help children learn to read and think critically. Or maybe I could work with Aunt Martha, help her expand the boarding house into something bigger." "Whatever you decide, you will be brilliant at it," Samuel said with certainty. "What about you?" Katherine asked. "What do you want?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I want to build something," he said finally. "I have spent 10 years tearing down every connection I had, running from anything that tied me to one place or one person. But now I want to build a home, a life, a family maybe, if I am lucky enough to find someone willing to take a chance on a rough mountain man who does not know the first thing about being civilized." Katherine's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "I think you might be more civilized than you give yourself credit for," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel turned to look at her, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her breath catch. "Katherine, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "I am in love with you." The words came out rough, almost harsh, but the emotion behind them was unmistakable. "I know it is too soon, and I know I have no right to feel this way when you are still grieving, but I cannot keep it inside anymore. You have changed everything for me. Made me want things I thought I had given up on forever." Katherine felt tears welling up, but they were not tears of sadness. "It is not too soon," she said fiercely, "and you have every right to feel however you feel. I love you too, Samuel. I think I started falling in love with you that first night when you sat beside me in the dark and did not try to fix what could not be fixed. You just stayed." Samuel reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his calloused palms gentle against her skin. "Can I kiss you?" he asked. "Yes," Katherine breathed. "Please." The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if they were both afraid of breaking something precious. But then Katherine's arms came up around his neck, and Samuel pulled her closer, and the kiss deepened into something that spoke of longing and promise and hope. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this right," he said. "Court you properly with your aunt's blessing. Build something real between us, something that will last." "We have already been building it," Katherine pointed out. "Every night, every conversation, every moment we have spent together. We have been building this from the beginning." They continued their nightly vigils at the cemetery, but now they included time for stolen kisses and whispered endearments, for planning a future together. Samuel met with Martha Walsh and formally asked permission to court Katherine, a conversation that resulted in Martha crying happy tears and hugging Samuel so hard he thought his ribs might crack. He started taking odd jobs around Bentonville, using his considerable strength and wilderness skills to help people with tasks they could not manage on their own. He repaired fences, cleared land, hunted game for families who needed meat for the winter. Slowly but surely, He became part of the community. Katherine watched him integrate himself into town life with a mixture of pride and amazement. The solitary mountain man was transforming before her eyes, becoming someone who belonged in civilization while still maintaining the core of who he was. He never lost his connection to the wild, still disappeared into the forest regularly to check his traps and commune with nature, but he always came back. He always came home to her. As November turned to December, the nights grew colder and the ground began to freeze. Katherine and Samuel discussed whether to continue their cemetery vigils through the winter, and ultimately decided together that it was time to transition. They would still visit Thomas's grave, but not every night, and not from dusk until dawn. It felt right, a natural progression from the intense grieving of those first weeks to something more sustainable. On their last all-night vigil, Katherine stood before her brother's grave and spoke to him for a long time. Samuel stood a respectful distance away, giving her privacy for this final goodbye to the ritual that had brought them together. "I miss you every single day," Katherine said softly, her hand resting on the marker, "and I always will. But I am going to be okay, Thomas. I found someone who helps me carry the weight of losing you, and I think you would have liked him. He is honorable and kind, and he makes me want to live fully again, to embrace the future instead of dwelling in the past. I am going to build a good life, the kind of life you never got to have, and I am going to live it well enough for both of us." She turned and walked back to Samuel, who immediately opened his arms to her. They held each other as the sun rose on a new day, a new chapter of their lives. Christmas came, and Samuel spent it with Katherine and Martha, experiencing the warmth of family for the first time in a decade. He had carved a beautiful jewelry box for Katherine, the wood polished to a soft gleam, with a mountain landscape etched into the lid. Katherine gave him a thick wool coat she had sewn herself, lined with rabbit fur and sturdy enough to withstand the worst winter could throw at him. Martha gave them both her blessing and her joy, declaring that she had not seen Katherine this happy since before her parents died. Winter deepened, and Samuel moved into one of the rooms at Martha's boarding house, paying his rent through a combination of money and labor. He and Katherine spent their evenings sitting by the fire, reading together, talking, dreaming. He taught her things he had learned in the wilderness: how to identify animal tracks, how to predict weather patterns, how to find water in dry terrain. She taught him things he had missed in his years of isolation: current events, new literature, the social graces he would need to fully integrate into society. But beyond all the teaching and learning, they simply enjoyed being together. Samuel would hold Katherine close, marveling at how perfectly she fit against his broad chest, at how right it felt to have someone to hold. Katherine would trace the muscles in his arms, fascinated by the strength contained in his body, feeling safe and protected in a way she had not felt since her parents died. In February, on a crisp, clear day with snow sparkling on the ground, Samuel took Katherine for a walk in the woods. He led her to a clearing overlooking a frozen stream where the view stretched for miles across the Ozark Mountains. The beauty of it stole her breath, the pristine white landscape gleaming in the winter sunlight. "This is where I want to build our house," Samuel said, his arm around her waist. "If you will have me, if you will marry me." Katherine turned to face him, her eyes wide. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I am." Samuel pulled a simple gold ring from his pocket. It had belonged to his mother, one of the few possessions he had kept from his old life. "I know I am not much. Just a mountain man with rough manners and rougher hands. But I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone, and I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy. Will you marry me, Katherine Walsh?" Tears were streaming down Katherine's face, but she was smiling wider than he had ever seen. "Yes," she said. "Yes, absolutely yes." Samuel slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he picked her up and spun her around, her laughter ringing through the frozen forest like bells. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, pouring all his love and promise and devotion into it. They were married in April, when the world was coming back to life after the long winter. The ceremony took place in the small church in Bentonville, with Martha crying happy tears in the front pew and half the town in attendance. Katherine wore a simple cream-colored dress, and Samuel wore a new suit that Martha had helped him pick out, though everyone agreed he still looked like he belonged in the mountains. But that was fine. That was who he was, and Katherine loved him for it. The reception was held at the boarding house, with tables of food and music and dancing. Samuel, who claimed he did not know how to dance, surprised everyone by sweeping Katherine around the floor with considerable grace. When she laughingly asked where he had learned, he just smiled and said he had been practicing in secret. They spent their wedding night in a room Martha had specially prepared for them, with fresh flowers and clean linens and complete privacy. Samuel was gentle with Katherine, taking his time, making sure she felt cherished and loved. Afterward, they lay tangled together, and Katherine traced patterns on his muscular chest. "I cannot believe this is real," she whispered. "6 months ago, I thought my life was over. I wanted to die, Samuel. The pain was so bad that I could not imagine ever wanting to live again." "I know," Samuel said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I felt the same way after my sister died, but look at us now." "We found each other in a cemetery at midnight," Katherine said with a soft laugh. "That is the strangest and most beautiful thing about all of this. That death brought us together, but life is what we built from it." "We built something good," Samuel agreed. "And we are going to keep building it, every day for the rest of our lives." True to his word, Samuel began construction on their house that spring. The site overlooked the frozen stream Katherine had fallen in love with, and the design incorporated elements from both their visions. It would be a sturdy cabin, built to withstand mountain winters, but with large windows to let in light and a wide porch where they could sit and watch the sunset. Samuel did most of the heavy labor himself, his powerful muscles flexing as he lifted logs and drove nails. But he had help from men in town who had come to respect, and like the former mountain man. Katherine spent the spring and summer helping Martha at the boarding house while also preparing for their move. She sewed curtains, collected furniture, planned where everything would go. But she also made sure to visit Thomas's grave regularly, bringing flowers and sitting beside the marker to tell her brother about her new life. The grief had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something bearable, something she could carry without being crushed by it. By autumn, exactly 1 year after Katherine and Samuel first met, the house was finished. It was beautiful, rustic, but comfortable, with a large stone fireplace and a kitchen that made Katherine exclaim with delight. Samuel carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing, and set her down in the center of their new home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Barrett," he said. "Welcome home, Mr. Barrett," she replied, pulling him down for a kiss. They settled into married life with surprising ease. Samuel continued to trap and hunt, selling furs and meat to supplement their income, but he also took on work as a guide for people wanting to explore the Ozark wilderness. Katherine discovered a talent for writing, penning articles about life on the frontier that she sold to newspapers back east. Together, they built a life that honored both their need for wilderness and their need for community. In December, Katherine discovered she was pregnant. She told Samuel on Christmas Eve, watching his face transform with wonder and joy. He immediately became even more protective than he already was, fretting over her constantly, making sure she was not working too hard or getting too tired. Katherine found it both endearing and occasionally exasperating, but she loved him for his care. Their son was born in late summer of 1878, a healthy baby with his father's gray eyes and his mother's blonde hair. They named him Thomas Samuel Barrett, honoring both the brother Katherine had lost and the man who had helped her survive that loss. Samuel held his son with a reverence usually reserved for religious experiences, his large hands cradling the tiny infant with infinite gentleness. "He is perfect," Samuel whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Katherine, he is absolutely perfect." "He is ours," Katherine said, equally emotional. "Our miracle." Parenthood transformed them both in unexpected ways. Samuel discovered reserves of patience he never knew he possessed, spending hours rocking Thomas to sleep or playing simple games to make him laugh. Katherine found that motherhood connected her to her own mother in new ways, understanding for the first time the depth of love her parents must have felt for her and Thomas. They made regular trips into town, partly for supplies and partly to maintain their connection to the community. Martha was a doting grandmother in all but name, spoiling young Thomas shamelessly, and providing Katherine with the support and advice only an experienced woman could offer. The house that had once been filled with grief became a place of laughter and life. When Thomas was 2, Katherine became pregnant again. This time she knew what to expect, and the pregnancy progressed smoothly. Their daughter was born in spring of 1881, a tiny thing with dark hair and her mother's eyes. They named her Rose Martha Barrett, after the wildflowers Samuel had picked for Katherine during their courtship, and after the aunt who had been so instrumental in their happiness. With 2 children, their cabin in the mountains felt smaller but no less warm. Samuel added on 2 more rooms, creating spaces for the children to grow. He built toys for them, carved animals and dolls from wood, taught them from an early age to respect the wilderness. Katherine educated them at home, reading to them constantly, teaching them their letters and numbers, instilling in them the same love of learning that her brother had possessed. The years passed in a blur of seasons and milestones. Thomas grew into a thoughtful boy who loved books and nature in equal measure, showing early signs of the lawyer his uncle might have become. Rose was wild and free, climbing trees and catching frogs, following her father into the woods every chance she got. Katherine and Samuel watched their children grow with a mixture of pride and bittersweet awareness of time's passage. They still visited the cemetery together, though not as often as they once had. On the anniversary of the night they met, they always returned to sit beside Thomas Walsh's grave, holding hands and remembering. Sometimes they brought the children, telling them about the brave uncle they had never met, making sure his memory lived on. "You think he would have been proud of us?" Katherine asked one October evening, 10 years after that first fateful meeting. They sat beside the grave as the sun set, their children playing nearby under Martha's watchful eye. "I think he would be amazed by you," Samuel said. "By the woman you have become, by the life you have built from the ashes of grief. I am amazed by you every single day." Katherine leaned against his solid shoulder, drawing comfort from his presence just as she had all those years ago. "I could not have done any of it without you." "You saved me, Samuel. In every way a person can be saved." "You saved me too," Samuel replied. "I was existing, not living, going through the motions but feeling nothing. And then I heard you crying and everything changed. You gave me a reason to rejoin the world, to care again, to love again." We saved each other. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. The grief that had brought them together would always be a part of Katherine, a scar on her heart that would never fully heal. But it was a scar she had learned to live with, and more than that, it was a reminder of the love she had shared with her brother and the love she had found with Samuel. As they walked back to where their family waited, hands clasped and hearts full, Katherine thought about that first night when Samuel had sat beside her in the dark. She had been drowning in despair, convinced she would never feel anything but pain again. But Samuel had thrown her a lifeline simply by staying, by being present, by refusing to let her face her anguish alone. That single act of compassion had changed both their lives irrevocably. It had brought a solitary mountain man back into civilization and given a grieving woman a reason to keep living. From death and sorrow, they had created life and joy. It was not the story either of them had expected to live, but it was theirs, and it was beautiful. Years continued to unfold in their mountain home. By 1890, Thomas was 12 and Rose was 9, both of them growing like weeds, as Martha liked to say. The cabin had been expanded twice more, growing to accommodate their family and the life they had built. Samuel had become something of a legend in the area, known for his tracking skills and his knowledge of the wilderness, often called upon when someone got lost in the mountains. Katherine's writing had gained her a modest but dedicated readership, her articles about frontier life striking a chord with people back east who romanticized the West. But beyond their individual accomplishments, it was their marriage that remained the foundation of everything. After 15 years together, Samuel and Katherine had developed the kind of partnership that looked effortless from the outside, but was actually the result of consistent work, communication, and commitment. They still sat together every evening after the children went to bed, talking about their days, their dreams, their concerns. They still held hands when they walked. They still kissed each other goodbye every morning and hello every evening. The passion of their early romance had evolved into something deeper and more enduring, a love that had been tested by time and had only grown stronger. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Samuel surprised Katherine by taking her back to the clearing where he had proposed. The children stayed with Martha, giving them a rare night alone. Samuel had prepared everything in advance, setting up a tent and building a fire, recreating as much as possible that first night they had spent together in the cemetery. "I wanted to remind you," Samuel said as they sat by the fire, "of where we started, of what we survived and what we built from it." Katherine looked around at the wilderness surrounding them, at the man beside her who had been her rock through every storm, and felt her heart overflow with gratitude. "I never forget," she said. "Every day, I remember how lucky I am. How easily I could have lost myself to grief, and how you pulled me back." "We pulled each other back," Samuel corrected. "That is what love does, Katherine. It gives us a reason to keep going when we want to give up. It reminds us that we are not alone even in our darkest moments." They made love under the stars that night, taking their time, savoring each other, celebrating the 15 years they had been together and the hopefully many more to come. Afterward, wrapped in blankets and each other's arms, Katherine told Samuel about an idea she had been developing. "I want to write a book," she said, "about grief and healing and finding love in unexpected places, about how the worst moments of our lives can sometimes lead to the best things. I want to tell our story, Samuel, so that maybe it can help someone else who is drowning in sorrow." Samuel was quiet for a moment, considering. "That is a deeply personal thing to share with the world, I know, and if you are not comfortable with it, I will not do it. But I keep thinking about how alone I felt in those first weeks after Thomas died, how certain I was that no one could possibly understand what I was going through. If telling our story could help even one person feel less alone, Would it not be worth it? You have the biggest heart of anyone I have ever known, Samuel said, pressing a kiss to her temple. If this is something you feel called to do, then I support you completely. Just promise me one thing. What is that? Make sure people know how brave you are. How you faced your grief instead of running from it. How you chose to live even when dying seemed easier. That is the real story, Katherine. Not that I sat beside you in the dark, but that you kept showing up, night after night, doing the hard work of healing. Tears slipped down Katherine's cheeks. I will tell the whole truth, she promised. The pain and the healing, the darkness and the light, all of it. The book took Katherine 2 years to write. She poured her heart onto the pages, reliving the worst and best moments of her life, capturing the rawness of early grief and the tentative hope of new love. Samuel read every word as she wrote it, offering feedback and support, sometimes crying at the memories she evoked. When it was finally finished, Katherine sent the manuscript to several publishers in New York and Chicago. It was rejected 4 times before a small publishing house in Boston agreed to take a chance on it. Sunrise After Sorrow, a true story of grief and grace, was published in the spring of 1893 with a modest initial print run. Katherine had low expectations, prepared for the book to disappear without making much impact. Instead, it resonated deeply with readers across the country. People who had lost loved ones wrote to Katherine, thanking her for putting into words what they had been unable to express themselves. The book sold steadily, going through multiple printings, and suddenly, Katherine found herself with a platform she had never expected. Samuel watched his wife's success with immense pride, though he found the attention somewhat uncomfortable. He was still, at heart, a mountain man who preferred trees to crowds and silence to conversation. But he supported Katherine through everything, accompanying her on a trip to Boston to meet with her publisher, standing beside her at readings and signings, always her steady anchor in an increasingly busy world. Through it all, they made sure to protect what mattered most: their family, their home, their connection to each other. No matter how busy Katherine got with her writing and the attention her book generated, she always made time for Samuel and the children. And Samuel continued to provide for them through his work, his strength and skills never diminishing even as he moved into his late 40s. Thomas, their eldest, decided at 16 that he wanted to go to college and study law, just as his uncle had dreamed of doing. The announcement brought tears to Katherine's eyes, though she quickly blinked them away. She and Samuel had saved money over the years, and combined with the income from Katherine's book, they were able to send him to a good school in St. Louis. It was hard to watch him go, their firstborn leaving the nest, but they were also bursting with pride at the young man he had become. Rose, meanwhile, showed no interest in formal education beyond what her mother taught her at home. She wanted to be a wilderness guide like her father, to spend her life in the mountains helping others appreciate the natural world. Samuel began training her in earnest, teaching her everything he knew about tracking, survival, and reading the land. She took to it naturally, her wild spirit finding its home in the untamed places. In 1895, Katherine received word that her book was being taught in some universities as an example of honest memoir writing. The news was surreal. The idea that her personal story of grief and love was now part of academic discussion. But more meaningful were the letters that continued to pour in from regular readers, people who saw themselves in her story and found comfort in knowing they were not alone in their suffering. Martha lived to see all of this, celebrating her 75th birthday in 1896, surrounded by family. She had sold the boarding house a few years earlier, moving into a small cottage in town, but she remained deeply involved in all their lives. She doted on her grandniece and grandnephew, took pride in Catherine's literary success, and loved Samuel like the son she had never had. When Martha passed away peacefully in her sleep in early 1897, the whole family mourned. They buried her in the same cemetery where Thomas Walsh rested, where Katherine and Samuel's story had begun. At the funeral, Katherine spoke about the debt she owed her aunt, how Martha had given her a home when she had nothing, had supported her through her darkest days, had welcomed Samuel with open arms and helped him transition back into society. "She taught me," Katherine said through her tears, "that family is not just about blood. It is about showing up for each other, about choosing to love even when it is difficult, about creating space for people to heal and grow. She did that for me, for my brother, and for Samuel. Her legacy lives on in all of us and in the love we share." Samuel held Katherine as she wept, just as he had held her so many years ago beside a different grave. The grief was different this time, easier to bear because Martha had lived a long, full life and because they had had time to prepare. But it was grief nonetheless, another layer added to the complex tapestry of their lives. They continued to visit the cemetery regularly after Martha's death, now tending 3 graves instead of 1. Thomas's marker had weathered with time, the carved letters growing softer, but Samuel maintained it carefully, replacing it when necessary, making sure his brother-in-law's memory was preserved. Martha's grave sat beside Thomas's, the two people who had shaped Catherine's life in such profound ways now resting side by side. Young Thomas graduated from law school in 1898 with honors, and true to his uncle's dream, he dedicated himself to helping people who could not afford proper legal representation. He opened a practice in Little Rock, fighting for workers' rights and defending the vulnerable. Katherine and Samuel attended his graduation, their pride evident to everyone who saw them. Their son was living the life his uncle had never gotten the chance to live, and there was a beautiful symmetry in that. Rose, at 17, had become one of the most skilled trackers in the region, often accompanying her father on expeditions. She had inherited Samuel's comfort in the wilderness and Katherine's way with words, writing vivid descriptions of the natural world that her mother helped her polish and publish in nature magazines. She showed no interest in marriage, declaring that she was married to the mountains, and Katherine and Samuel supported her choice completely. As the new century approached, Samuel and Katherine found themselves in their 50s, looking back on lives well lived. They had survived loss and found love, had raised children who were making positive impacts on the world, had built something meaningful from the worst moments of their lives. The cabin that had started as a dream was now filled with memories, every corner holding stories of laughter and tears, of growth and change. On October 15, 1900, exactly 24 years after the night they met, Samuel and Katherine returned once more to the cemetery. It had become their tradition, this annual pilgrimage to the place where their story began. They were older now, silver threading through Katherine's blonde hair and Samuel's beard, but the love between them had not diminished. If anything, it had deepened, matured like fine wine, becoming richer and more complex with age. They sat beside Thomas's grave as the sun set, holding hands just as they had done so many times before. The cemetery had grown over the years, new markers appearing as the town expanded, but this corner remained familiar, almost sacred in its significance. "You ever regret it?" Katherine asked suddenly. "Giving up your solitary life in the mountains for all of this?" Samuel turned to look at her, his gray eyes still as clear and steady as they had been 24 years earlier. "Not for one single moment," he said firmly. The wilderness gave me peace, but you gave me purpose. You gave me a reason to be part of the world again. I would make the same choice 1,000 times over. I was so broken when you found me, Katherine said softly. I did not think it was possible to ever feel whole again. You were not broken, Samuel corrected. You were grieving, which is different. Grief is not a sign of weakness or brokenness. It is a sign of love, proof that you cared deeply enough to hurt deeply. And you did not let it destroy you. You faced it, carried it, transformed it into something beautiful. Katherine leaned her head against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence just as she had all those years ago. We have had a good life, have we not? The best life, Samuel agreed. Better than I ever imagined possible. They stayed until the stars came out, talking about the past and the future, about their children and their hopes for them, about the ways their lives had exceeded their wildest dreams. When they finally stood to leave, Samuel pulled Katherine close and kissed her under the starlight, a kiss that contained 24 years of love and devotion and partnership. "Thank you," Katherine whispered against his lips, "for sitting beside me that first night, for staying every night after, for building this beautiful life with me." "Thank you," Samuel replied, "for letting me, for trusting me with your grief and your heart, for choosing me every day for 24 years. They walked home hand in hand, back to the cabin they had built together, to the life they had created from the ashes of loss. Behind them, 3 graves stood silent in the moonlight, monuments to the people who had shaped them, but also to the power of love to transcend death. Thomas had died, but his memory lived on in his nephew who fought for justice. Martha had passed, but her legacy of love and acceptance continued through the family she had helped create. And Samuel and Katherine, who had met in a place of death and mourning, had proven that even the darkest nights eventually give way to sunrise, that grief and love can coexist, that the human heart has a remarkable capacity for healing when given time and companionship. Their story, which had begun with weeping over a grave, had blossomed into something extraordinary. Not because anything particularly dramatic had happened, but because they had chosen each other consistently, had done the daily work of building a relationship, had honored both their pain and their joy. They had created a legacy not just in their children, but in everyone whose life had been touched by their story, everyone who had read Katherine's book and found hope in her words, everyone who had been guided safely through the wilderness by Samuel's skill and care. As the years continued to pass, Samuel and Katherine remained devoted to each other and to the life they had built. They watched Rose establish herself as one of the premier wilderness guides in Arkansas, leading groups through the Ozark Mountains and teaching people to appreciate the natural world. They celebrated when Thomas successfully argued a case before the state Supreme Court, winning rights for workers that would affect thousands of people. They welcomed grandchildren into their lives, Rose eventually surprising them all by falling in love with a botanist she met on one of her expeditions, and giving them twin granddaughters who were as wild as their mother. Through all of it, through every joy and every sorrow, through every triumph and every challenge, Samuel and Katherine remained each other's constant. They still held hands. They still talked for hours. They still looked at each other with the same love and wonder that had blossomed in a cemetery under starlight 24 years earlier. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1907, their children and grandchildren gathered at the mountain cabin for a celebration. There was food and music and laughter, the house bursting with life and love. As the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Samuel pulled Katherine aside for a private moment on the porch they had sat on countless times over the years. 30 years, Katherine said wonderingly. 30 years since we promised ourselves to each other. Best decision I ever made, Samuel said, his arms around her waist. Marrying you, building this life with you. I love you more today than I did 30 years ago, and I loved you pretty fiercely even then. I love you too, Katherine said, reaching up to touch his bearded face, her fingers tracing the lines that time had etched there. You are still the man who sat beside me in the dark when I needed someone most. You are still my greatest adventure. They kissed as their family watched from the windows, smiling at the couple who had shown them what real love looked like. It was not about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about showing up, day after day, year after year. It was about choosing each other through the good times and the hard times. It was about building something together that could withstand whatever life threw at them. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Samuel and Katherine stood together on their porch, looking out at the wilderness that had been both sanctuary and home. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. The wind whispered through the pine trees. The world continued its eternal turning, indifferent to human joy or sorrow, but they had carved out their place in it, had created meaning and beauty from pain and loss. Their story, which had started with a mountain man finding a woman weeping over a grave, had become a testament to the power of compassion, the resilience of the human spirit, and the transformative nature of love. They had taken the worst night of Katherine's life and turned it into the beginning of something extraordinary. They had proven that sometimes the people who save us are the ones who simply refuse to let us face our darkness alone. And as they stood there together, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had built, they knew with absolute certainty that they had done something rare and precious. They had found each other against all odds, had chosen love when it would have been easier to choose isolation, had created light in the midst of overwhelming darkness. The graves in the cemetery would always be there, reminders of what they had lost. But this home, this family, this love was a reminder of what they had found. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Not the grief that had brought them together, but the love that had carried them through everything that came after. Samuel pressed a kiss to Katherine's temple, and she leaned into him, solid and steady as always. Behind them, their children and grandchildren laughed and talked, creating new memories in the house that love had built. And above them, the stars wheeled slowly across the sky, bearing witness to a story that had begun in sorrow but had become something beautiful beyond measure. They had found each other in the darkest hour, and they had never let go. Through 30 years of marriage and nearly 31 years of knowing each other, they had built a life that honored both the past and the future, that acknowledged pain without being consumed by it, that celebrated love in all its complicated, messy, wonderful glory. And as the night deepened around them, Samuel and Katherine Barrett stood together on their porch, exactly where they belonged, exactly where they had always been meant to be, together. Always together, from that first night until this moment and for all the moments still to come. Together, they had turned grief into grace, darkness into light, a chance meeting in a cemetery into a love story for the ages.